For 8 winters, the only knock on Levi Mercer's door was the wind. His world had shrunk to the size of a cold bed and a single chair at the kitchen table. The day he buried his wife, Rachel, the silence moved in, and it wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the heavy, suffocating kind that swallows sound whole. The ranch ran on muscle memory. Cows were fed, fences were mended, but the man doing the work was a ghost, a shape moving through a life that belonged to someone else. He was a husk. Until one evening, as the sun bled out behind the western ridge, a sound cut through the stillness. Not the wind, not a coyote, a whisper. Levi stepped onto the porch, his hand instinctively going to the worn axe handle leaning against the wall. The last sliver of dusk caught 5 shapes huddled by his front gate. Not men, girls, young women caked in dust, their dresses torn to rags. One clutched a bundle to her chest that he realized, with a jolt, was a baby. Another, older, had a dark bruise blooming on her cheek, which she tried to hide behind a curtain of matted hair. They were kneeling, as if in prayer, or in surrender. The oldest one, who couldn't have been more than 16, lifted her head. Her eyes were ancient. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We'll work. We'll sleep in the barn. Just don't send us back." "Back where?" Levi didn't ask. He couldn't. The word was choked with the terror so profound he could almost taste it. He looked at their faces, one by one. Fear, exhaustion, but underneath it a sliver of something else, something hard as flint. He gave a slow, single nod. He opened the gate, and for the first time in 8 years, the porch groaned under the weight of more than one person's sorrow. He handed out blankets, his rough hands clumsy with the forgotten act of giving. He lit the stove, and the kitchen filled with a warmth that felt foreign, almost painful. But as the girls huddled by the fire, a new kind of quiet settled in. A watchful quiet. One of them kept glancing over her shoulder at the darkened window, as if expecting a face to appear in the glass. Another flinched when a log popped in the fire, her body instantly coiling like a sprung trap. The youngest, a tiny thing with eyes too big for her face, didn't speak a word. She just clung to the eldest girl's skirt, her knuckles white. What had they run from? What kind of monster leaves tracks like that on a person's soul? And why here? Why his ranch, a place so forgotten even the mail rider sometimes skipped it? Levi felt a deep, forgotten cavern in his own chest echo with their silent screams. Something was broken in them. That much was clear. But as he watched them, he realized something had been broken in him for a long, long time. And what was coming wasn't a rescue. It was a reckoning. Levi didn't ask their names that first night. Words felt too loud, too clumsy for the space they now shared. He just pointed to the hearth, to the pot of beans simmering on the stove, to the clean water in the basin. It was a language he still knew, the language of survival. The oldest girl, the one with the ancient eyes, led them inside. He'd later learn her name was Celia. She moved with a strange, unsettling grace, her shoulders squared, her head constantly turning, scanning every corner, every shadow. She was a soldier in a war he knew nothing about. The second girl, Flora, limped heavily. Her left shoe was gone, her foot wrapped in a bloody rag. She didn't make a sound of complaint, but her jaw was set so tight, Levi thought it might crack. The third, Hazel, had burrs tangled in her wild hair, and a gaze that seemed to look right through him, fixed on something far away and terrible. She found a spot against the far wall and slid down to the floor, pulling her knees to her chest. Then there was Nora, small and wiry, who watched everyone. She watched Levi, she watched Celia, she watched the door. Her eyes were sharp, calculating. She was the lookout. And the youngest, Ivy, clutched a worn corn husk doll as if it were the last anchor in a storm-tossed sea. Her dress was too big, hanging off her small frame, a ghost of a garment that belonged to someone else. A mother, maybe. Levi found himself moving with a quiet he hadn't practiced in years. He stepped around the creaky floorboard near the pantry. He placed the tin plates on the table without a clatter. He cooked what little he had: beans, salt pork, biscuits hard as rock. The girls ate. They didn't speak, just bent over their plates, their spoons moving with a desperate rhythmic scrape. When they were done, they didn't scatter. They curled up together on the worn rug before the fire, a single breathing mound of shared trauma. He gave them his bed, the one that had been half empty for 8 years, and took the lumpy cot on the porch for himself. The wind picked up that night, howling a lonely tune around the eaves. Levi sat wrapped in a thick wool coat, watching the firelight flicker against the window pane. Inside, 5 souls were breathing in unison, and for the first time he could remember, he felt the tight, frozen knot in his own chest begin to loosen, just a fraction. He was breathing with them, but the question returned, colder than the wind. Who were they running from? And why did their silence feel so terrifyingly familiar? The next morning, Levi woke to the acrid smell of burning flour. He pushed himself off the cot and walked into the kitchen. Celia stood at the stove, her back rigid, holding a cast-iron skillet like a shield. The biscuits inside were charred black, sending up a plume of bitter smoke. She was scraping at them furiously with a knife, her knuckles white. "I'll do better tomorrow," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. It wasn't an apology. It was a promise. Or a threat. Levi just nodded and poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot. He held one out to her. She hesitated for a second, her eyes flicking to his hand, then back to his face before taking it. Her fingers were careful not to brush against his. It was a transaction, not a shared moment. By midday, he found Flora out by the chicken coop. She'd somehow hobbled all the way from the house, her makeshift bandage dark with fresh blood. She was tossing cracked corn to the hens, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't ask permission. She just did what needed to be done. He saw her stumble over a tree root, catching herself on the wire fence with a sharp intake of breath. She didn't cry out. She just pushed herself upright and kept going. Her resilience was terrifying. Later, a crash echoed from the kitchen. Levi walked in to find Hazel standing frozen amidst the shards of a broken ceramic mug. She wasn't looking at the mess on the floor. She was staring at her own hands, her body braced for an impact. A blow. A scream. He expected her to run, to cry. She did neither. She just stood there, waiting for the punishment she clearly believed was coming. Levi quietly got the broom and dustpan. He swept the pieces into his calloused palm, the sharp edges not even registering. "There's another in the cupboard," was all he said. Hazel blinked, a flicker of confusion in her vacant eyes. She gave a small, jerky nod, her fingers still trembling. That evening, Nora refused to eat. She sat at the table, her back ramrod straight, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The other girls cast worried glances her way, but said nothing. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Finally, little Ivy slid off her chair, walked over, and solemnly placed her corn-husk doll on Nora's plate. It was a strange, sacred offering. Only then did Nora's posture soften. She picked up her spoon and began to eat, her eyes never leaving the doll. The ranch was no longer still. It was filled with this soft, broken, unpredictable movement. And still, Levi asked no questions. He didn't ask about the bruise on Celia's face, or the scars he saw crisscrossing Flora's back when her dress shifted. He didn't ask why Hazel flinched every time he picked up the axe, or why Ivy sometimes woke in the night, screaming in a language he didn't recognize, a torrent of guttural sounds that made the hair on his arms stand up. That night he was running a hand along the dusty porch rail when his fingers brushed against something that wasn't wood. It was a small scrap of cloth. faded blue, almost gray, tied neatly around one of the spindles. It hadn't been there yesterday. He untied it slowly. The fabric was coarse, unfamiliar. He turned, his eyes scanning the tree line at the edge of his property. The woods were dark, but they didn't feel empty. Someone had been here. Someone had left a message. A marker. They were being watched. And the quiet of his ranch was no longer a shield. It was a target. The days that followed were a fragile truce with the past. Celia was the first to ask for something. She didn't speak it aloud. Levi found a scrap of paper on the kitchen table with 2 words written in neat, careful script. Flour. Thread. He took the list on his weekly trip to town and returned with a 50-pound sack of flour and a dozen spools of black thread. He left them by the door without a word. That evening, the scent of baking bread filled the small house for the first time since Rachel was alive. It was a ghost of a smell, but it was real. He saw Celia in the corner by the fire, her hands moving with a surgeon's precision, stitching a tear in Hazel's dress. She wasn't just mending cloth. She was mending a life. Flora's limp began to fade. The first time Levi heard her laugh, it was so quiet he thought he'd imagined it. She was coming back from the creek, a bucket of water in each hand, and she'd slipped on a patch of mud. Instead of crying out, a small, breathy chuckle escaped her lips. "This ground's got a mind of its own," she'd said to no one in particular. He saw a change in her, a softening around the eyes. The constant terror was being replaced by a cautious awareness. She was starting to see the world around her again, not just the threats within it. One afternoon he found Hazel in the barn, a bucket of old red paint and a brush in her hand. She was methodically, silently, painting the faded barn doors. She hadn't been asked. The idea seemed to have simply come to her, an act of creation in a life that had only known destruction. Nora joined her, then Ivy. By sunset, the barn doors were a brilliant, defiant red, a beacon against the muted landscape. Levi had spent the afternoon patching the roof above them, the rhythmic tap of his hammer a steady counterpoint to the swish of their brushes. That night, the kitchen was different. It glowed. Ivy had found some wild daisies and put them in a tin can on the table. Celia's cornbread didn't burn. And Nora, who rarely spoke, told a quiet story about how her mother used to say the stars were holes in the floor of heaven. When Levi walked through the room to head for the porch, for the first time, they didn't fall silent. They didn't flinch. Their conversation simply made room for him, a seamless, unspoken acceptance. He sat on the top step, leaning his weary back against the post. Behind him he could hear their voices, a low, gentle murmur, punctuated by Ivy's occasional giggle. The sound was like water seeping into dry, cracked earth. It was life. It was happening. The ice around his heart was beginning to thaw, not with a crash, but with a slow, aching melt. Before bed, he found Ivy's corn-husk doll sitting in one of his worn work boots by the door. She had taken a scrap of the red paint-stained cloth and fashioned a tiny coat for it, stitched with the black thread he'd brought from town. He picked it up, his thumb tracing the clumsy, earnest stitches. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just nodded to himself in the dark. The silence was no longer empty. It was full. But a full house is easier to see from a distance, and peace this fragile is a temptation for the wolves that prowl in the dark. The first letter came on a Wednesday. It wasn't delivered. It was placed. Tucked into a crack in the porch floorboards, a single folded page held down by a small, smooth river stone. Celia found it. Levi saw her from the barn, saw her stoop down, her body going still. She picked it up, read it once, her face becoming a mask of stone. Then, without a word to anyone, she walked back inside, lifted the lid on the wood stove, and dropped the paper into the flames. It flared up, a bright orange curse, and was gone. But a feeling lingered in the air, bitter and cold. The easy rhythm of the house was broken. At supper, no one spoke. Celia just pushed food around her plate. Flora kept her hands balled into fists in her lap, her knuckles white. Hazel wouldn't look at the door, her eyes darting to the windows instead. It was later, after the lanterns had been turned down low, that Ivy broke the silence. She was curled in a chair by the dying fire, her small voice barely a whisper. "They always find us." Levi didn't press her. He didn't ask who "they" were. He knew it wouldn't matter. He just added another log to the fire, making it roar back to life, a defiant blaze against the encroaching night. He found a loose board in the windowsill and hammered it tight. That night he didn't sleep on the porch. He dragged his cot into the main room, placing it directly in front of the door. The next morning Nora came to him while he was cleaning his rifle. "Teach me," she said. It wasn't a request. She stood in the yard, her small feet planted firmly, her hands holding the heavy rifle with an awkward but determined grip. He showed her how to load, how to aim, how to control her breathing. She missed the first shot, and the second, and the third, but she didn't get frustrated. She just reloaded, her movements becoming more fluid, more certain. Her fifth shot hit the outer edge of the tin can he'd set on the fence post. Her sixth shot sent it spinning. A flicker of something, not joy but grim satisfaction, crossed her face. "You don't have to be afraid here," Levi said softly. She turned to look at him, her gaze level and unnervingly direct. "I don't know how to stop." "You'll learn," he promised, though he wasn't sure if it was true. That afternoon, Hazel painted a sign. She found an old piece of wood, and with the leftover red paint, carefully lettered the words, "No trespassing." Her handwriting was beautiful, elegant, a shocking contrast to her wild appearance. She hung it on the front gate herself. It was a prayer turned into a warning. In the barn, Celia was sewing again. Not mending this time. She was taking old flour sacks and faded bedsheets and transforming them into new dresses for the girls. Simple, sturdy dresses. Dresses for staying, not for running. Levi watched them all from the porch, these 5 souls who had arrived on their knees. Now they were standing. They were preparing. They were taking up space in the world, refusing to be erased. That night, under a sky littered with stars, Levi found himself whispering Rachel's name. And then, one by one, he whispered theirs. Celia, Flora, Hazel, Nora, Ivy. He didn't know why, but it felt like the same kind of prayer. But prayers for peace are often answered with the drumbeat of war. The shadows were gathering just beyond the reach of the lantern light, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that they would not stay shadows for long. The tension in the house became a living thing, a 6th resident. It sat at the dinner table with them. It slept in the corners of the rooms. One afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, Flora was sweeping the porch when she suddenly stopped. She dropped the broom with a clatter, one hand flying to her stomach, her face pale. She bent over, not in pain, but as if trying to physically hold herself together, to keep from shattering into a million pieces. Levi, who was mending a harness in the doorway, froze. His first instinct was to rush to her, but something held him back. It was Nora who moved first. She walked out of the house with a dipper of cool water and handed it to Flora. She didn't ask what was wrong. She didn't fuss. She just sat down on the steps beside her, a small, solid presence. They sat there for a long time, 2 sisters bound by an unspoken grief as the shadows grew longer around them. Inside, Hazel had taken a dishcloth and draped it over the small, cracked mirror that hung by the door. She offered no explanation. No one asked for one. The house was becoming a fortress, its defenses built not of stone, but of shared trauma and silent understanding. That night, the lamp burned late. Celia was at the table, stitching the hem of a blanket, her needle moving with a relentless, punishing rhythm. Each stitch was a tiny act of defiance, a way of fastening her world down, of keeping it from flying apart. It was Ivy who finally gave voice to the fear that choked the air. She was washing potatoes at the sink, her small hands scrubbing the dirt away. She looked up, her eyes finding Levi's in the dim light. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, her voice small, "if you're just filling an empty house with other people's ghosts?" Levi paused, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at the 5 girls, at the life that had seeped back into the cracks of his broken world. "I used to," he said, his voice rough. "Now I just worry the walls ain't strong enough." His words hung in the air, heavy and true. And then from outside came a sound that cut through the night. A horse's nicker, sharp, agitated, and it wasn't one of his. Nora was on her feet in an instant, her body taut, her eyes locked on the dark trail that led up from the creek. Every muscle in Levi's body went rigid. Someone was coming. This wasn't a traveler seeking shelter. This was the past riding hard, come to collect its debts. The silence was over. The war was at the gate. The rider's shadow fell across the porch long before the horse came to a halt. It was a long, sharp shadow thrown by the rising moon. Levi stepped out to meet it, his hands loose at his sides, his face unreadable. The man didn't dismount. He sat atop a tall black gelding, looking down at Levi as if he were something he might scrape off his boot. He was dressed in town clothes, but they fit him wrong, too tight across the shoulders. He wasn't a rancher. He wasn't a farmer. He carried the easy arrogance of a man who got his way not through hard work, but through fear. "Name's Deputy Barnes," he said, his voice flat and cold as a river stone. "From over in Stillwater County." He gestured vaguely with his chin toward the house. "Got a report about some strays, 5 of them. Said they ended up here." Levi didn't move. "They're not strays." Barnes let out a short, ugly grunt. "That ain't what their owner says. Says they're his property, indentured. Runaways from the Silas Reform School for wayward girls." The name fell into the night like a rock into a still pond. Silas. Inside the house, Levi heard a sharp, collective intake of breath. Flora let out a small, strangled whimper. He saw Hazel's hand fly to her mouth. "They're free folk," Levi said, his voice dangerously quiet. "They work for their keep. Here." "Is that so?" Barnes swung himself down from the horse. He was taller than Levi, but leaner, with a predator's coiled energy. "Silas Blackwood has papers. Legal papers. Says they belong to him until their debt is paid." Just then, Nora stepped out of the house. She stood beside Levi, small but unbowed, the old rifle held loosely in her hands. "We don't owe him nothing," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Nothing but pain." Barnes's eyes flickered to the rifle, then back to Nora's face. A slow, cruel smile spread across his lips. "You got fire, girl. He likes that. Makes breaking you all the more satisfying." He took a step forward. "Now, Mr. Mercer, you can hand them over nice and easy, or I can come back with a warrant and the men to enforce it. Your choice." Before Levi could answer, Celia appeared in the doorway, then Ivy, then Hazel. They stood together, a silent, defiant wall of 5. "This is our home now," Celia said, her voice shaking but firm. "You're trespassing." Barnes laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "This ain't over." He looked from Levi to the girls, his eyes lingering on Flora's slightly rounded belly, with a look of hungry appraisal that made Levi's blood run cold. "Silas always gets what's his." He swung back up onto his horse. As he turned to leave, his horse shifted, and the moonlight caught the brand on its flank. A simple, elegant S entwined with a thorny vine. He spurred the animal and disappeared into the darkness. The porch was silent for a long moment. Then Celia spoke, her voice a dead whisper. "That horse, it's one of his. The Black Briar brand. Levi turned to her. "Who is this Silas?" Celia finally looked at him, and in her eyes he saw a bottomless pit of despair. "He's not a schoolmaster," she said, her voice breaking. "He's a monster. And we didn't just run away from him. We stole something. Something he wants back more than anything." The air grew thick, charged with the unspoken truth. Levi looked at Flora, at the way she instinctively cradled her stomach. It wasn't just the girls Silas wanted. It was the baby. The baby she was carrying was the key, and the monster was coming for it. For 2 days, a heavy, expectant silence fell over the ranch. It wasn't the quiet of grief or the quiet of peace. It was the held breath before a storm. They worked, but their movements were mechanical, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Nora cleaned the rifle 3 times a day. Hazel collected and sharpened every tool in the barn, lining them up against the wall like weapons. Ivy barely spoke, her corn-husk doll held in a death grip. They were preparing for a siege. On the third night, Celia found Levi on the porch, staring out into the oppressive darkness. She sat down, not beside him, but across from him on the top step. "You have a right to know," she said, her voice low. "You have a right to tell us to leave." Levi just shook his head. "This is your home." A tear, the first he had ever seen her shed, traced a path through the dust on her cheek. "The Silas Reform School isn't a school. It's a workhouse, a prison. He takes in girls with no family, no one to ask after them. He works them from sunup to sundown in his laundry and his mill. But that's not the worst of it." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "He rents us out to rich men passing through, for parties, for anything they want." The ugly words hung in the night air. Levi felt a cold, murderous rage build in his chest, a feeling so intense it almost choked him. "Flora," he started but couldn't finish. Celia nodded, her face grim. "One of the men was a regular. He liked her. Told her he would buy her contract from Silas, take her away. She believed him. She let him. She thought it meant freedom." Celia's voice hardened. "When she told him she was with child, he never came back. And Silas was furious. Not because he cared about Flora, but because a pregnant girl is damaged goods, unprofitable." She looked down at her hands. "But then he found out who the father was, a wealthy man from the East with a wife who couldn't give him an heir. Suddenly the baby wasn't a problem. It was a product. Silas made a deal to sell the child as soon as it was born." The horror of it settled over Levi, a physical weight. They hadn't just escaped. They had stolen Silas Blackwood's prize. "So we ran," Celia whispered. "We ran for the baby. We ran for our lives." Levi was silent for a long time, the pieces clicking into place. The desperation, the terror, the brand. But one question remained. "Why here?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Out of all the places in this territory, why my ranch?" Celia looked up, and for the first time there was something other than fear in her eyes. It was a flicker of hope, so fragile it was almost painful to see. "Because of her," she said softly. "Because of Rachel." Levi's blood went cold. "My wife?" "Years ago," Celia said, "before she married you, she worked for a season as a tutor in Stillwater. She saw what Silas was. She tried to report him, but he had the sheriff, the judge, everyone in his pocket. No one would listen. But before she left, she helped one girl escape. She gave her a map that led here." She reached into her dress and pulled out a tattered, folded piece of oilcloth. She handed it to him. His hands trembled as he opened it. It was a crude map, drawn in charcoal, the lines faded with time. But there, at the end of the trail, was a small, unmistakable drawing of his barn, with its unique cupola. And beneath it, in his wife's elegant handwriting, were the words, "Levi Mercer's place, a good man." a safe harbor. The story had become legend among the girls at the school, a ghost story whispered in the dark, a myth of a safe place, run by the husband of the angel who had tried to save them. He had been living on a sanctuary and had never even known it. His grief, his isolation had been a beacon. He looked from the map in his hand to Celia's face. He was no longer just a bystander, a man who had opened his door out of pity. He was a part of their story. He was the keeper of his wife's promise, the last stand of Rachel's war, and he would not fail her. He stood up, the old hollowed-out feeling inside him, replaced by a core of pure, unyielding steel. "Go inside," he said, his voice a low growl. "Bar the door. Put the lamps out. They're coming. Tonight." The world outside the cabin shrank to the pale, moonlit circle of the yard. Inside, every sound was magnified, the creak of a floorboard, the shudder of the window frames in the rising wind. Levi moved with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't a fighter, not by nature, but he was a rancher. He knew his land. He knew its secrets, its traps, its hollows. He barred the heavy oak door. He shuttered the windows, leaving only tiny slits to see through. He handed the rifle to Nora. "Stay by the east window. Don't shoot unless they cross the porch. Aim for the center." She nodded, her face pale, but her hands steady. She was no longer a frightened girl. She was a sentry. He gave Celia the heavy axe from the woodpile. "The door is your only job. Don't let it break." She took it, her knuckles white, her jaw set. Hazel, silent and ghost-like, had gathered the sharpened tools from the barn. She placed a pitchfork by the back door, a scythe by the hearth. She was turning their home into a fortress of farm implements. Levi took his father's old hunting knife and a length of rope. He moved to the darkest corner of the room where Flora and Ivy were huddled together. He looked at Flora, at the fierce, protective way she held her body. "Stay away from the windows," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "No matter what you hear." Then he turned to Ivy. He knelt down so he was at her eye level. "I need you to be the bravest of all," he whispered. "I need you to be quiet. Can you do that for me?" The little girl, who hadn't spoken in days, looked at him, her huge eyes filled with a terror that ripped at his heart. But she nodded, a single solemn dip of her chin. He looked at them all, this strange, broken, beautiful family he had found in the ruins of his life. His fear was a cold knot in his stomach, but stronger than the fear was a white-hot rage. They would not have them, not while he drew breath. A sound from outside, a single horse approaching slowly. Then another, and another. Levi peered through the slit in the window shutter. 3 riders. One was Barnes. The other 2 were large, rough-looking men. And in the center, on the tall black gelding with the Blackbriar brand, was a man in a dark suit. He was smaller than the others, but he radiated an aura of absolute authority. Silas Blackwood. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply dismounted and walked to the edge of the porch, stopping just out of the lantern light. "Levi Mercer," he called out, his voice smooth and cultured, like a preacher's. It was the most terrifying sound Levi had ever heard. "I know you're in there. You have something that belongs to me. Several things, in fact. I am a reasonable man. Send them out, and I will overlook your role in this unfortunate matter. No one need be harmed." The silence from the cabin was his only answer. Silas sighed, a sound of theatrical disappointment. "Very well, Barnes. You know what to do." Barnes dismounted, a heavy iron pry bar in his hand. He walked onto the porch, his boots thudding a slow, menacing rhythm. He approached the door. Levi braced himself. Celia lifted the axe. Nora sighted down the barrel of the rifle. The first blow struck the door with the force of a thunderclap. The heavy wood shuddered, but held. Then came the second blow. A crack appeared near the latch. Silas stood back, watching, a faint smile on his face. He was enjoying this. The third blow splintered the wood around the lock. The door was about to give way, and then from the east window a flash of orange and a deafening boom. Barnes grunted, staggering back, dropping the pry bar. He clutched his shoulder, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. Nora had fired. She hadn't aimed to kill. She had aimed to stop. A deadly calm descended. Silas's smile vanished. His face contorted into a mask of pure fury. "You will regret that," he hissed. "Burn it. Burn it all down." One of his men dismounted, pulling a torch from his saddlebag. He lit it, the flames leaping up, casting dancing, monstrous shadows across the yard. He started toward the house. It was over. They were trapped. But then Levi saw it. Hazel. She hadn't been waiting. She had been acting. While all eyes were on the front, she had slipped out the back. He saw a flicker of movement near the barn. She had opened the gate to the small corral, the one where he kept the half-wild bull. And now she was running straight at the massive animal, waving a red blanket, screaming a silent, desperate war cry. The bull, enraged, confused, charged out of the corral, not at Hazel, who scrambled up the fence to safety, but straight toward the man with the torch. The man yelled, dropping the torch as he dove out of the way. The bull, now in a full-blown panic, thundered through the yard, a 2,000-pound battering ram of blind fury. It slammed into Barnes's horse, sending it screaming into the night. It sideswiped the other man, knocking him to the ground. Silas scrambled back toward his own horse, his composure gone, his eyes wide with fear. The diversion had worked, but it wouldn't last. "Nora, the horses!" Levi yelled. She understood immediately. She reloaded, took aim. 2 more shots cracked through the night. Not at the men. At the ground in front of their spooked horses. The animals reared, broke their reins, and bolted into the darkness. Silas and his men were stranded. Levi didn't hesitate. He ripped the bar from the door, kicked it open, and charged into the night, the hunting knife gripped tight in his hand. This was his land, and tonight he was taking it back. The yard was chaos. The bull bellowed in the distance, crashing through the underbrush. One of Silas's men was struggling to his feet, dazed. The other, Barnes, was still on the ground, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Silas stood alone, his fine suit covered in dust, his face a snarl of disbelief and rage. He saw Levi coming and drew a small, silver-plated pistol from his coat. He was faster. He raised the gun, the moonlight glinting on the barrel. Levi lunged, not at Silas, but to the side, grabbing the dropped pry bar. The pistol fired, the shot searing the air past Levi's ear, so close he felt the heat. He didn't stop. He brought the heavy iron bar around in a wide, desperate arc, slamming it against Silas's gun hand. There was a sickening crack of bone. The pistol flew into the dirt. Silas screamed, a high, thin sound of pain and outrage. He stumbled back, cradling his shattered hand. He was a man accustomed to power, to his will being law. He had no idea what to do when faced with raw, physical defiance. He looked at Levi, his eyes filled with a venomous hatred. "You pathetic farmer," he spat. "You think this saves them? I own the law in this territory. I will have you hanged for this." "Maybe," Levi growled, advancing on him, the pry bar held ready. "But tonight, you answer to me." From the house the door opened. Celia stood there, the axe in her hands. Then Nora, reloading the rifle. Then Hazel, her face streaked with dirt, her eyes burning with a cold fire. They walked out onto the porch and down the steps, a slow, deliberate procession. They formed a semicircle around Silas, their faces grim, their bodies radiating a collective, silent fury. These were not the broken, kneeling girls who had arrived at the gate. These were survivors. They were warriors. Silas looked from one to the other, his arrogance finally cracking, replaced by a primal fear. He was surrounded by his victims, and there was no pity in their eyes. He saw not what he had done to them, but what they had endured. He saw the ghosts of 1,000 abuses, 100 heartbreaks, all directed at him. "What? What are you going to do?" he stammered, his voice losing its smooth veneer. Celia stepped forward. "We're not going to kill you, Silas. That would be too easy. That would be a mercy you never showed us." She looked at Levi. "The rope." Levi handed her the rope he'd brought from the house. She walked behind the whimpering Silas and, with swift, practiced motions, tied his hands behind his back. The knots were tight, efficient. The kind of knots a girl who'd worked in a laundry for years would know how to tie. Barnes and the other man, seeing their leader captured, made no move to help. They simply stared, their will to fight broken. By dawn, Levi had them all tied up in his barn. He sent Nora, the fastest and lightest, on his sturdiest mare. "Ride east," he told her. "Don't stop until you hit the next territory. Find the federal marshal, not the local sheriff, the marshal. Tell him everything." She nodded, her face set with determination, and was gone in a cloud of dust. For the next 2 days, Levi and the girls stood guard. They fed their prisoners bread and water and nothing else. They listened to Silas's threats, then his pleas, then his pathetic sobs. And they said nothing. They simply watched him, their silence a more profound punishment than any blow. When the marshal finally arrived with a dozen armed deputies, he found a strange scene. A quiet ranch, a defiant red barn, and 4 young women sitting on the porch, watching the sunrise as if they didn't have a care in the world. Justice, when it finally comes, is sometimes just a quiet morning after a long, dark night. The Silas Blackwood Reform School was shut down. The investigation revealed a horror story of corruption, abuse, and slavery that shocked the territory. Silas and his men were tried and sentenced to hang. The girls were declared free, their supposed debts erased. They were offered passage to anywhere they wanted to go. But when the marshal asked them where they were heading, Celia answered for all of them, her voice clear and strong. She just pointed back at the small, weathered ranch house. "We're already home." The ranch was never quiet again, but the sounds that filled it were different now. It wasn't the suffocating silence of grief. It was the hum of life. It was the sound of Ivy's laughter as she chased chickens in the yard. It was Hazel's low, soft whistling as she broke in the wild mare she'd claimed as her own. It was Nora reading aloud from a book in the evening, her voice steady and clear. It was Celia humming an old tune while she kneaded bread, a real smile finally reaching her ancient eyes. The silence hadn't been defeated by noise. It had been replaced by peace. 2 months after the siege, in the middle of a calm autumn night, Flora's labor began. It was not a storm of fear and pain this time. It was a quiet, powerful testament to their survival. Levi lit the lanterns while Celia held Flora's hand, whispering encouragement. Hazel boiled water, her movements calm and efficient. Nora and Ivy waited on the porch, a silent, hopeful vigil. Just before dawn, a new cry joined the sounds of the ranch, a strong, healthy wail that promised a new beginning. Flora held her daughter, her face wet with tears, but they were not tears of sorrow. "Her name is Rachel," she whispered, looking at Levi. "Rachel Lark Mercer." Levi felt that old, frozen knot in his chest, finally, completely dissolve. He was no longer a ghost in his own life. He was a father, a grandfather. He was the anchor of this strange and wonderful family. He had opened his gate to 5 strangers, and in doing so he had opened the door to his own salvation. They didn't fix him, and he didn't rescue them. They simply stood together in the darkness until the sun came up. They built a home not with wood and nails, but with courage, loyalty, and the stubborn, unbreakable promise of staying. Out on the vast, lonely plains, where the wind can strip a man down to his bones, they had found that the rarest and most precious thing in the world isn't gold or land. It's a safe harbor, a place to finally come home. If this story of courage and redemption in the Wild West moved you, and you want to hear more tales of justice being served under the wide open sky, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Let us know in the comments what you thought of Levi and his newfound family. And don't forget to share this with someone who needs a reminder that even in the darkest night, dawn is coming.